I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's July 1st, and we have a lot to talk about. Last week, I was in Philadelphia for a digital tools workshop that was hosted by the International Progressive MS Alliance. As we look at the world around us, it's hard to imagine a single aspect of our lives that hasn't been changed to some degree by technology. Just think about the capabilities of the device you're probably listening to this podcast on. As you're about to hear, digital tools can have a massive, positive impact on MS care and research. To kick off part one of our coverage of this important meeting, you'll hear from Dr. Tim Coetzee, the president and CEO of the National MS Society, and Dr. Robert Fox, the chair of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm with Dr. Tim Coetzee, the president and CEO of the National MS Society, and Dr. Robert Fox, the chair of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. We're here in Philadelphia because beginning tomorrow morning, the Alliance is hosting a digital tools workshop. Dr. Fox, what's the goal of this workshop?
The goal of this workshop is to learn about digital tools as they are applied to multiple sclerosis, and particularly how we can use digital tools to monitor multiple sclerosis, to track the progress, response to therapies, and even use digital tools as therapies. Now, one of the questions is, what are digital tools? And they are ways that we can collect information in an automated fashion. An analogy is the old way we used to do traffic reports with a helicopter flying over the city, looking at where the traffic jams were, or even people using their telephones to call in where accidents. Now we tracked people's personal phones, their smartphones, and where they slow down on the highways, we interpret as there being an accident. So we use technology in an automated fashion. And that's what we do in tracking the course of disease, and in tracking the response to a therapy, an intervention, and we're even learning how to use digital tools as an intervention, as a treatment to help improve the quality of lives of our patients.
Tim, how might the use of digital tools affect access to care for people living with MS?
Super interesting question, John. And obviously the first thing is we want to make sure that whatever we invest in is available to people. And, one of the challenges we face is when we think about digital tools, we tend to think about smartphones. Not everybody has a smartphone. So we have to actually think about what are tools that people can access, that are easy to use, that they use consistently. So that's another aspect. How many of us have put an app on our phone that we use maybe for 5 days and then we stop using it? Part of the work we need to do is understand what will people use that empowers them, that becomes integrated into their daily living so that they're tracking on it consistently, and that also can help them understand what's happening with the disease, and also help the doctors like Dr. Fox also understand what's happening in their patient.
I'm glad you use the example of smartphones, as we see more and more evidence supporting the effectiveness of digital interventions, ranging from things that we're pretty much familiar with these days, like telehealth appointments, all the way to self-guided cognitive behavioral therapy. The issue of equity becomes more important than ever. How's the National MS Society addressing the challenge of digital equity so that everyone has access to these tools?
Super interesting question, and one we're still actually trying to get our arms around, because when you talk about digital equity, there's so many places. If some of that comes down to understanding where people live, where do they have access to Wi-Fi, where do they have access to cell phone towers, a digital tool of high-speed internet access. All of those are things that within our advocacy strategy are things we're looking at, so that we can get our governments to actually make those investments so that people have the infrastructure they need, that their cell phone can tap into. It's a long-term challenge, but it's also part of our equity agenda as well.
I know the Society's healthcare access team has done a lot of work exploring and continues to explore rural health and its implications for people living with MS. Is this something that sort of ties into that initiative?
It does, and so in the United States, obviously, since you have a global podcast, we have many parts of our country where people don't have ready access to a doctor, where they have to drive for hours to get to a doctor, rural environments, as we would call them. And we've actually done some work to understand where are all the MS specialists, where do people with MS live, and how far does it take on average for someone to get to see a doctor? And that's part of our agenda, that we need to understand where people are, where they're distributed, so that we can then figure out the gaps. And this is true not just in the United States. It's true in so many parts of the world where people don't have access to clinicians. We need to start there, but then also add these extenders and accelerators, as I think about them, of access to digital tools, internet, and other pieces that enable them to live more powerfully.
Dr. Fox, how do you see digital tools impacting clinical practice and MS research?
Tools can help with practice in that we can capture what's really going on with patients in their everyday lives. Patient may come into my clinic or even log into a virtual visit and share some words with how they're doing. But when I can actually capture what they are doing on a day-to-day basis and compare that to what they were doing before, I can get better granularity and better insight into what's really going on to help them out.
I want to cover MS research in a second, but you raise an interesting point. With all that granular data, are there going to be digital tools that will help the physician sort of process all of that data in a reasonable amount of time?
Yes. So as the expression goes, garbage in, garbage out, which is to point out that you can capture a lot of things, but you don't necessarily know what is the important aspects and what are impactful aspects that would then change the course of a treatment or lead to a certain response in terms of an intervention or a change in a symptom therapy. So we do need to learn how to distill out what is the useful and important and informative information and figure out how to separate to find the truly useful elements.
And let's talk about the impact of digital tools on research. Where do you see that?
So in research, it can be very helpful in understanding, again, how a therapy is truly impacting a patient's function, their day-to-day activities. These digital tools can measure in a much better way than we can measure at the clinic. We can measure on a neurologic exam, which is rather clunky. We can measure some performance examinations in the clinic, like how long it takes to put pegs into a pegboard or how long it takes to walk 25 feet. But that doesn't really tell me what's going on in patients' everyday lives. And the digital tools can help with that. In addition, digital tools can be an intervention in and of themselves. And this can get at what Dr. Coetzee was mentioning about access. If a patient doesn't have access to a clinic or to a specific intervention or to a therapist, like a physical therapist or a machine, we can bring the technology to them through the digital tools and provide what may benefit them from the comfort of their house. And that is another powerful aspect of digital tools as a therapeutic intervention.
Looking at the agenda for this workshop, I noticed that throughout the entire workshop, there are multiple presentations from people who are living with progressive MS. Why is the patient perspective so important in this work?
Well, it's incredibly important because none of this makes any difference or none of this gives us any insight unless the patients tell us that it does have an insight. None of these tools are going to be used unless the patients say, yes, I'm going to use them. And yes, that makes sense for me to use them, whether it's a monitoring tool or whether it's an intervention tool. So having the direct input of people living with MS, people affected by MS, their care providers, is vitally important for us to understand, particularly this end of the spectrum of research, where we are looking at the actual interventions and the impact of our interventions on patients' daily life.
Well, Dr. Robert Fox, Dr. Tim Coetzee, I want to thank you both for taking a moment to talk with me.
It's been a pleasure being with you, John.
Great to be with you again, John.
As the co-chair of the workshop, Dr. Jennifer Graves did an amazing job driving the meeting forward. In the opening presentation, Dr. Graves energized the entire room and set the table for what was to come over the next 2 days. In a moment, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. Graves. Dr. Jennifer Graves is a neurologist and professor of neurosciences at University of California, San Diego Health, where she also serves as vice chair of human clinical research and division chief in neuroimmunology. This morning, Dr. Graves gave the opening presentation at the workshop, providing an overview of the current landscape when it comes to digital tools and a really fascinating discussion of the development of new tools and next steps in developing tools. And one in particular really caught my attention, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But I thought I'd begin by posing a question you posed at the beginning of your presentation. You mentioned how EDSS is the gold standard in the clinic, and then you posed the question, in creating a 21st century neurological exam, should we be anchoring on EDSS? So, should we?
So it's a really important question because we want to improve upon our gold standard, but when we need to compare it, we could be limited in what we're able to develop. There are ways to approach this. One of them, which we've taken, is to make sure there are at least some correlations with these gold standards, but when we're developing a new approach and a new algorithm, there are ways to do it in which you're not required to anchor on that gold standard. So I think it's a combination of making sure it has clinical meaningfulness, that it has some association or correlation with those gold standards, also some correlation with patient-reported outcomes and patient significance. But when we're doing, in particular, longitudinal assessments, trying to make them agnostic approaches that allow us to discover something new.
Talking about new approaches, you talked about a study, detection of disability with wearable multi-sensors. And you mentioned a 5-minute test that was all about measuring finger tapping and foot tapping. And this 5-minute test was able to distinguish progressive from relapsing remitting MS. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, so finger taps and foot taps are really attractive as measurement because they're repetitive movements and they're very amenable to mathematical and signal processing algorithm development. And we know clinically that people with progressive disease start to exhibit subtle dysfunction to more gradual and obvious dysfunction over the course of the disease. So it's a really great paradigm for applying these digital tools. It's very easy, it's not cumbersome for the patients, and we work with devices that could be placed on the arm or leg, so we can even compare progression in the arm or leg in a way we can't do with certain measures. And these are sensitive enough and the mathematical algorithms are strong enough such that we were able to distinguish patients following them for just 6 to 12 months in patterns for relapsing and progressive disease.
You also mentioned that this next generation multi-sensor is currently being tested under a grant from the Department of Defense. I'm curious, was that grant part of the MS research program that the Department of Defense manages?
It absolutely was.
Thanks for pointing that out. And I think I'll take a moment to remind my listeners that this is the program that has been defunded for next year. And this is a real-world example of how real research is going to advance progress in being able to diagnose, treat MS. Imagine the benefit of a 5-minute test that could measure progression in MS. It's remarkable to think about, and this is the kind of programs, the kind of high-risk, high-reward kinds of programs that the Department of Defense has always funded until now. And I just felt it was worth mentioning. And I guess as someone who's leading research, not just in this program, but as a real leader in MS research, are you concerned about what we're seeing in terms of funding cuts to research programs, to the NIH, to the Department of Defense?
I'm, of course, concerned. I think it's very important that we try to communicate to our leaders and the public just what these programs do and how they accomplish and how they have moved things forward. I'm concerned. I'm an advocate. I think it's important we share our voice, but I think it's also important that we're not afraid and that we keep pushing forward. We're here to represent the voices of people living with MS, and we push forward on the research that needs to happen for this very special population.
As I listened to your talk, it sounded as much like an engineering lecture compared to any MS-related presentation I've ever heard. And it occurred to me, I'm wondering, as technology is driving progress at a rate we've really never seen before, is this the future of medicine?
I do think we're going to start seeing more and more intersection of biomedical engineering, other types of engineering, signal processing engineering in medicine. Currently, it's an interesting question. Currently, we don't train our young people in these types of skill sets, and certainly we don't need to have all doctors have extensive engineering training, but some of the basic principles of data that comes from wearable sensing and the devices we're going to be using in the future might be of interest to future training for medical students. We teach them basic statistics. It might be time to teach them a little bit of basic engineering.
Well, Dr. Jennifer Graves, I want to thank you for all the work you do in so many different areas. In addition to research, I'm going to add advocacy to that. Thanks so much for taking a few minutes to talk with me today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Dr. Ann Helm's presentation focused on using digital technology to capture patient-reported outcomes. After her presentation, I had a chance to talk with Dr. Helm. Dr. Ann Helm is head of research and access at the MS International Federation. Dr. Helm's presentation focused on digital tools designed to capture patient-reported outcomes. So, Dr. Helm, let's start with perhaps you introducing a lot of my listeners to what the PROMS initiative is all about.
Thank you, John. So the PROMS initiative, or the Patient Reported Outcomes for MS initiative, is a large global multi-stakeholder collaboration that is looking at how can we best use patient-reported outcome measures to improve research and healthcare for everybody affected by MS across the world. Now, patient-reported outcomes are any kind of report of a person's health or status that comes directly from them without interpretation by a clinician or healthcare professional, for example. And why we're really interested in them is that they can tell us about the direct lived experience of a person living with MS, and really find out what is most meaningful to them and what has the greatest impact on their daily lives. And then we can make that scientifically and clinically relevant so that we can make our research and healthcare systems more effective.
Well, I think you just started answering my next question. I was going to ask you, why are patient-reported outcome measures important in progressive MS?
So here, I think patient-reported outcome measures can be more sensitive to the changes in somebody's condition over time. So we know that some of the current clinical measures, which are used as the gold standard and which, if you are a person with MS, I'm sure you will be familiar with, such as the EDSS measure, we can find that people may have the same score on the EDSS, but as a person living with MS, they report that they know that things are changing. Maybe something in their hand function is getting worse. Maybe it's something to do with their walking ability. So a patient-reported outcome measure can be more sensitive and can pick up these changes and could signal that something needs to change in the care or the management of the person with MS.
During your presentation, you mentioned the potential for using patient-reported outcome measures in the updating of the MS course descriptors. I'm curious about that because it seems to me that patient-reported outcome measures are going to be specific to symptoms that someone's experiencing, while the updated course descriptors are really going to be more reflective of the biological mechanisms and sort of move a little bit away from clinical presentation when it comes to describing MS.
That's a really good question. So our theory is that what people are telling us through patient-reported outcome measures could actually reflect some of that underlying biology. So to really understand, how do we group people with MS into different, I suppose, clusters of people that might need some different aspects of care, or may experience a different course of their disease over time, or different clusters that then we can use to make our clinical trials more effective. So there are probably a number of different measures that we can use to understand what's happening with that biology, and patient-reported outcomes could be considered as part of that mix overall. And we've seen from, some of the examples that I presented, that patient-reported outcomes are able to distinguish groups of people with relapsing MS versus progressive MS. So this is why we think they have a role to play in helping us to define those MS course descriptors.
I've always kind of looked at MS in a visual sense as sort of like a puzzle. I was thinking of, how do you resolve or reconcile the concept of patient-reported outcomes and PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity? And it occurs to me, maybe you don't resolve them, but you take all of it into proper consideration.
Yes, absolutely. This is where digital technology could really come in, because it's about putting all those pieces of the puzzle together. So what is being measured in a clinic, plus what is the person with MS telling you, and what does that uncover? Especially over time, when we're talking about PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity, those are changes that are being picked up over time. So digital technology can help with that continuous monitoring, and hopefully we'll be able to distinguish between something that is, a fluctuation in symptoms over the course of a day or over the course of a few weeks, between something that actually signals an overall worsening in somebody's condition.
How can our listeners learn more about the PROMS Initiative and get involved in the PROMS Initiative?
So we keep everybody updated about the PROMS Initiative a lot through LinkedIn. If people can search for the Global PROMS Initiative there, you will get regular updates from us. Also through the MS International Federation and the Italian MS Society and some of the other MS organizations around the world, we share some of the big changes and the news and results that are coming out. But also, when we do go out to people living with MS and try and gather their experiences on a wide basis. So far we have conducted 2 global surveys to get people's direct experiences. When those opportunities come up, we'd strongly encourage anybody who is living with MS to take part and to share your insights, because for us as part of the PROMS Initiative, it's the lived experience of people with MS that is the starting point for everything that we do.
Well, as I did with the most recent survey, I will certainly alert my listeners to when it's time to visit the website and participate themselves. Dr. Helm, I want to thank you for all you do on behalf of the PROMS Initiative and representing the patient voice in research, as well as your work in the MS International Federation. Thank you again, and thanks for spending a few minutes talking with me.
Thank you, John, for inviting me to chat with you today.
Dr. Stephen Gold hasn't been planning on how he might use digital tools. Dr. Gold presented details from a digital study that he's already successfully completed. In a moment, you'll hear Dr. Gold discuss that study with me, and I think you'll get a first glimpse into how a digital therapeutic intervention can be a game changer. Dr. Stephen Gold is at the Charité Medical Center in Berlin, Germany, and Dr. Gold's presentation at the workshop centered on his extensive research in internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as a means of reducing depression among people with MS. And you opened your presentation Dr. Gold, by saying, why internet-based CBT? So I'm going to ask you that question. Tell us, why internet-based CBT?
Well, thanks for having me. A pleasure talking to you. So I think if you look at CBT delivered through the internet, there's two possible ways why this might be particularly suitable for symptom management in multiple sclerosis. The first one is because the classical therapeutic applications of CBT are on psychiatric conditions and symptoms like depression and anxiety. And we know that those are one of the most common comorbidities that people living with multiple sclerosis are dealing with. So that's one part, sort of a therapeutic indication. The second part is that the internet delivered part, so the I in the ICBT. And I think that is particularly helpful because it could help overcome barriers to access. We all know that certain symptoms of multiple sclerosis, mobility, probably the most prominent one, it's really hard to get places. If you have to go travel far to go to a therapist's office every Monday at 3 p.m., that could actually be interfering with a lot of the things that you're experiencing. One is mobility, but it could also be that on that specific time and day, you have problems with fatigue or you have cognitive issues that make it hard to work through a more traditional setting of psychotherapy. So the internet delivery, which means remote access, but it also means at your own pace and on demand, which I think are two features that might help people if they have access to work through it more easily. So the combination of those two factors, I think, are a key advantage for ICBT to be used for symptom management in multiple sclerosis.
Now, your first pass at this involved what I'll call a generic CBT program. In other words, it was internet delivered CBT, but it was not specific to multiple sclerosis. It was something anyone could use who might be dealing with depression. I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And then as a result of some encouraging results there, the program was rewritten to be specific to multiple sclerosis. And what did you learn?
Well, so I think it was interesting that we took this program off the shelf, basically. It had no content specific to multiple sclerosis or multiple sclerosis related problems in it. We did a small trial in Germany. It worked with moderate effects. So people who used the program as opposed to people who did not immediately have access to the program reduced the severity of their depressive symptoms. So on sort of the results end, it looked really promising, but we started talking to people who had participated in the trial. And some things that they mentioned is that, yeah, it was great. It had a couple of interesting suggestions, but it felt like it was ignoring something that is key in my personal experience with depression and multiple sclerosis, and that is the multiple sclerosis. And that had different shapes and forms in which this was mentioned. Some of it was, well, it was suggesting certain sports activities that were inappropriate for my level of walking ability, for example, or it was suggesting things that I ran into problems with because of my fatigue or because of my... So that was one part of it. But the other part of it is that multiple sclerosis as a potential contributor or cause of symptoms of sadness or other aspects or loss of energy was not mentioned at all. So it felt like there was a big part cut out that they felt were relevant, and they wanted to be able to start learning how to approach this. And as part of this co-design process, we sat down with both the designers of the app, the clinicians, and the people with lived experience to say, well, what part of this program would need to be customized in terms of mentioning aspects of multiple sclerosis, and what part do you personally want to be able to customize yourself? So, for example, there were some surveys introduced where they say, my main problems are A, B, and C. So then the program would respond to that and recommend modules that dealt primarily with that. And if you said, fatigue is no issue for me, then it would not be spending a lot of time on that. So I think those are the two adaptations that we made to the program that made it easier to use, but also more appropriate and more helpful to the people using it in the second trial we did.
And in that trial, what were the long-term outcomes?
So the first observation was that in the initial phase, so this program is designed to be used over 12 weeks with like one module per week, which you can do at your own pace. But the recommendation would be these modules take about 30 minutes to complete, 30 to 45 minutes, but you could do it whenever you want them. But in order to allow for the learning process, it's recommended you do one per week. So you're looking at a 3 months usage time. So that was, and the effects in these 3 months, were positive. So people using the program had larger reductions in depressive symptoms that were a bit stronger than we saw in the non-specific version of the program. But I think the important part is then, even after they stopped using the program, their depression levels remained stable up until 12 months. There was no further improvement. Then weren't using the program anymore, but they didn't go back to the levels they had before. And I think the idea is that these types of programs, they're supposed to help you learn new skills, how to deal with certain difficulties that you have in your life, which you should then be able to apply to your life even after the program has finished. And that's, I think, is unless the circumstances change.
Well, that makes sense. So let's fast forward to where we are today, not only where we are in terms of time, but where we are in terms of place. Your initial work, the larger study that you did was done both in Germany and the US. There is a study that is recruiting right now called Cafe MS in the United States. What can you tell me about Cafe MS?
Okay. Cafe MS is using similar tools. So they're also internet-delivered behavioral interventions, quite similar to the tool that we had in depression. We're testing 2 different versions of it here in the US. And they're, instead of targeting depression, they're targeting fatigue. They're also built on work that we did previously in Germany with a similar app for fatigue management rather than depression management, but also based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. And this trial here in the US is now trying to see whether 2 different versions of this program are helpful in helping people manage their fatigue in the long run. And I think the other really crucial part about this trial, it's a very, very big trial, especially for this type of intervention. So that we will be able to see, are there certain characteristics or subgroups of people that do or do not respond to these, or where these tools are or are not particularly helpful, which helps us target them better and help people better to have their personal management help through these programs.
The final part of your presentation dealt with getting digital tools into clinical care. Can you talk a little bit about what that is going to involve?
Yeah, so this is a very, very tricky question. And I think that's something that is a continuous problem for some of these interventions globally, because getting things into clinical care, we know, is always difficult. For these digital tools, there's several additional ways that make it more difficult. So the first thing is technological advance. So even if I run a clinical trial of my tool 3 years ago, the technology will evolve over time. It's not a drug, right? The drug will be the same 5 years ago and today. So the traditional way of first generating the evidence, then convincing the regulatory authorities, and then implementing it as it works for drugs doesn't necessarily work the same way for medical devices.
So running an app on a Palm Pilot probably isn't very effective, efficient, or even possible today.
Exactly. So the question would be, well, even if I did develop a program back on the BlackBerry, and I'm now running it on a different platform, is that still the same intervention, right? So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that, obviously there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of self-help apps that you can download in your app store. But they have not gone through that rigid scientific process of safety and efficacy. So I think if you're looking at software as a medical device, you're in a different realm than what you just find in your app store. But because of that, it also needs a different level of regulation and possibly also reimbursement for people to actually access their medical devices. And I think there's a very big variability from country to country how that is dealt with.
I think I can see here in the United States, for instance, somebody gets a prescription for a medication. They're very clear, and their insurance provider is very clear on what the reimbursement rules are. But when the prescription is for software, it's not nearly as clear, is it?
I think that's something that is a moving target right now. So it's a very new development, and different countries and different regulatory authorities have developed pathways for this. So I'm coming from Germany. In Germany, there is an established pathway for these softwares as medical devices where you can actually get reimbursement through the public health insurance, but it's also been around for only 4 years. There are other countries where there's similar models, but they're not necessarily the same model. So it's again, for somebody who's developing these tools and then trying to roll it out into different jurisdictions or different regulatory spaces, will have to deal with a very different set of requirements and rules in every single one of these countries. And also in terms of reimbursement might be very different in a country that has public health insurance versus a more fragmented reimbursement system as you have in other countries.
Gaining regulatory approval, FDA or EMA in the case of Europe, does not automatically equal reimbursement.
It usually does not mean that at all. Again, there's a couple of countries where these two processes are actually tied. So regulatory approval is directly tied to reimbursement, at least through some of the channels. But that requires a health system where there's a big enough part of the health system that's covered by the same health insurance system, basically. And I think that is going to be a challenge for a lot of countries. And we haven't even begun to discuss in a more global context. If you're outside of high income countries, it's possibly even more challenging to get these things rolled out and reimbursed.
Well, Dr. Gold, I want to thank you for your pioneering work in this particular field. Depression, as I sure don't have to remind you, is something that affects so many people living with MS. More than half the people living with MS at some point are diagnosed with depression. Being able to access a tool one day from the comfort of your own home that's going to allow you to work through the process at your own rate, at your own speed, on demand, I think we're all looking forward to that.
Thank you very much for talking to me, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS from the International Progressive MS Alliance Digital Tools Workshop. I hope you'll join me next week for part 2 of our coverage of this important meeting. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society, and you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/409. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.